I'm Mariana, 31, a tactical transport pilot trained in the Air National Guard. For years, I bent over backwards to be accepted by my mother-in-law, holidays, favors, even upgrading her flight out of my own pocket. But when an engine exploded mid-flight and I stood up to help, she shouted across the cabin that I wasn't real military. That moment changed everything. Ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you tried your best to support? Drop your story in the comments, you're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to take back your power after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories on setting boundaries and standing tall. What happened next might just surprise you. My name is Mariana Bloom, I'm 35 years old, and I grew up around propellers, radios, and engine oil under my fingernails. My dad flew crop dusters in northern Texas. He wasn't flashy about it. He didn't talk about flying like it was heroic or cinematic. For him, it was work. And for me, it was just what we did. I learned how to check oil levels before I learned how to braid my hair. By 12, I could run a pre-flight inspection better than most junior pilots. I didn't think of it as special back then, it was just how we lived. Most weekends were spent at the airfield while my dad patched up one of the older Cessnas or bartered for replacement parts. My mom was a teacher and worked weekends tutoring, so I tagged along with him. I'd sit in the hangar with a clipboard and double-check his maintenance logs. He made me call out checklist items loud and clear, like I was briefing a crew, even if it was just the two of us. Discipline is muscle memory, he'd say. Get it right when it's easy, so you won't get it wrong when it counts. It stuck. I went to a state university and majored in aerospace engineering, not because I wanted to build planes, but because I wanted to understand how every bolt, cable, and flap worked together in the air. After graduation, I joined the Air National Guard. I didn't do it for glory, or for the uniform, or even because I thought it would impress anyone. I did it because I wanted the hours, the structure, and the responsibility. And the Guard gave me all three. I flew tactical transports, C-130s mostly. No combat deployments, but plenty of high-pressure work, disaster response, cargo runs into unpredictable weather zones, search and rescue coordination over rugged terrain. I learned how to make fast decisions with incomplete data. I learned how to stay calm when someone else's panic could cost lives. I logged over 1,600 hours during my first 7 years. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real work. Real consequences. And I got good at it. I met Daniel at a wedding in San Diego. He wasn't military. He was in architecture, quiet, steady, thoughtful in the way that engineers sometimes miss and designers seem to naturally possess. He didn't try to prove himself, and he never treated my job like a novelty. I appreciated that more than I knew how to say at the time. We dated long distance for a while, then I transferred units and moved to Richmond to be closer. We got married 2 years later. Backyard ceremony, simple vows, close friends. The only real stressor that day was his mother, Ellen. She wasn't rude, exactly. She was polite the way a blade is sharp. Sharp voice, sharper glances. You never saw the full cut until you were already bleeding. She had a Connecticut accent you couldn't place until she said the word Harvard and made it sound like a threat. Her smile was always just a few degrees too cold to be real. From the first time we met, she made it clear I wasn't what she had pictured. I could see it on her face. She expected someone softer. Someone who quoted poetry, not maintenance logs. I wore my uniform once to a family dinner, and she called it costume Y. That's the word she used. Costume Y. Like I was a kid playing dress-up in someone else's rink. Still, I tried. I made the effort. I bought her thoughtful gifts for birthdays. I volunteered to host Christmas when Daniel was too busy with deadlines. When she had minor surgery on her wrist, I drove her to and from her appointments and brought her groceries, even though she insisted she didn't need help. I walked her dog when it was too icy out for her to manage the steps. I included her in weekend brunches, remembered her preferences, offered to pick up the check more times than I should have. There was a Thanksgiving she almost didn't come to because her flight got canceled. Daniel was swamped at work. I booked her a last-minute seat on a different airline and paid out of pocket to upgrade her to business so she wouldn't have to deal with the middle row. She never said thank you. When she got off the plane, she made a joke to the flight attendant about my daughter-in-law, the pretend pilot. That was how she saw me. A hobbyist. Someone who played at being serious, but didn't quite qualify. It didn't matter how many hours I logged, or how many certifications I added to my file. It didn't matter that I'd trained pilots who now flew commercial routes across the country. In Ellen's world, you either wore a suit and carried a leather briefcase, or you were beneath notice. I didn't fit her mold, so she dismissed me entirely. Daniel saw it. He wasn't oblivious. But he didn't want to confront it either. He'd say things like, "She just doesn't understand your world," or "Give her time, she'll come around." He didn't understand that it wasn't a lack of knowledge that made her cruel. It was choice. She knew exactly how to cut just enough to hurt without ever being called out. Still, I tolerated it. For Daniel. For the hope that maybe one day, if I just kept being steady and unbothered and generous, she might meet me halfway. When Daniel suggested the trip to Florida, I was hesitant. It was supposed to be a mini vacation. We'd all go down together, get some sun, relax. He said Ellen had been feeling isolated lately, that she might appreciate a few days away. He framed it like a reset button, a chance to smooth things over. I agreed, even though I knew better. I booked the flights. Found a midday option so Ellen wouldn't have to wake up too early. Checked our bags the night before. I even offered to pick her up from her condo to save her the Uber fare. At the airport, she said, "No offense, but I like to ride in the back seat. I get nervous with female drivers." Then she laughed like it was a joke. But she didn't take it back. I let it slide. Again. Because part of me still wanted to believe that maybe, if I just kept showing up, she'd stop looking for ways to remind me I didn't belong. I thought if she saw me in my element, calm, organized, competent, something might shift. I didn't know yet that it would take an exploding engine at 35,000 feet for her to finally see who I was. And even then, I wasn't sure she'd be capable of it. 2 weeks before the trip, Ellen stopped pretending. Not that she'd ever gone out of her way to be kind, but there was usually a veneer of civility, a passive-aggressive rhythm we both followed. A way of keeping things clean for Daniel's sake. But something about the upcoming vacation gave her room to say more with less effort. It started with a brunch she hosted for some of her longtime friends, people I'd met before, but never quite warmed to. Daniel had to work, so I showed up alone. I brought fresh pastries from a bakery across town she liked, even though I knew she wouldn't mention it. Her friends were already seated when I arrived. Middle-aged women with expensive haircuts and stories about gallery openings, house renovations, or their adult children's projects. Ellen introduced me like I was the entertainment, not the daughter-in-law. "This is Mariana," she said. "She's in aviation." Sort of. They all laughed politely, unsure if it was a joke. "Oh, what airline?" one woman asked, turning to me. "I'm military. Air National Guard. I fly transports, C-130s mostly," I explained, keeping my tone neutral. Ellen chimed in before anyone could respond. "Oh, you should see her little uniform. It's like a Halloween costume. With patches and boots and all sorts of little buttons." She sipped her mimosa like she hadn't just insulted my profession. The table laughed again. Less politely this time. I smiled. Said nothing. But my appetite disappeared. After brunch, I mentioned it to Daniel while we were cleaning the kitchen. "She said what?" he asked, pausing with a plate in his hands. "Doesn't matter," I said. He frowned. "Of course it matters." But then he looked away and said, "You know how she is. She doesn't mean anything by it." I'd heard that too many times. Ellen had always been comfortable making herself the authority in any room, but lately, her remarks had shifted from passive-aggressive to overt. It was as if the older she got, the more convinced she was that her opinion required no filter. The trip became her latest excuse. "Florida is practically a retirement home now," she said during dinner one night. "I hope Mariana doesn't insist on bringing any survival gear. You know how she likes to over-prepare." Daniel chuckled and said, "She's a pilot, Mom. It's literally her job to prepare." Ellen rolled her eyes. "There's preparing, and then there's overcompensating." Later that week, Daniel and I were on the couch planning the itinerary. He was browsing rental car options while I made notes about weather conditions for the days we'd be there. "She doesn't mean anything by it," he said again, glancing at me. I didn't reply, because it wasn't just words anymore. It was patterns. And I'd stopped pretending I didn't notice. At the airport, I tried to keep things easy. We'd arrived early. I'd already checked our bags online. I had my TSA pre-check and offered to add Ellen as a companion. "Let me take care of it," I said, scanning our confirmation details. "It'll make security faster." She didn't even look up from her phone. "No need," she said. "I'm not playing soldier like some people." The gate agent flinched. I didn't respond. Daniel was halfway through texting a client and didn't catch it. Or maybe he did and chose not to comment. Either way, we moved through security in awkward silence. Inside the terminal, I tried again. Offered to buy her a bottle of water, maybe a snack. She declined both, then asked Daniel if the rental car company would upgrade her to something with a smoother suspension. "She had a sensitive back," she said, shooting me a look. "Maybe you can use your military status to get us priority boarding," she added dryly. "You know, lean into the role." I didn't answer. I just checked the boarding group number and sat down by the window. When our group was called, I stood first, reaching for my backpack. Ellen hesitated, then looked at the boarding pass and frowned. "Where am I sitting?" "You're in 22C, I said. "I'd prefer to be farther back. I get claustrophobic near the wings." "That's your assigned seat," I replied. She flagged down the gate attendant. "There must be something open in the rear. I need to move. I can't be near the engines." The attendant looked confused. "We're full, ma'am. I can ask someone to switch if they're willing, but you may end up in a middle seat." "That's fine. I just don't want to sit near." She cut herself off. The noise. She didn't need to finish. The message was clear. Daniel looked over at me. I said nothing. I didn't need to. She ended up in 27B. Window seat. 2 rows behind us. I sat in 22A. Daniel took the middle. 22C stayed empty. When the flight leveled out and the seatbelt sign went off, I closed my eyes and tried to zone out. The hum of the engines was steady, familiar, almost soothing. I let my head rest against the wall, breathing evenly, trying to imagine we were flying without her behind us. But Ellen had a way of making herself heard, even when you weren't listening. Somewhere around 30 minutes into the flight, I caught snippets of her conversation. She was speaking to the man next to her, a businessman from what I could tell. He asked what brought her to Florida. "Oh, family," she said. "My son and daughter-in-law." "She's in the military." "Sort of." The man must have asked something about my role, because I heard her laugh. "She's not a real pilot. Not like commercial. She's in the National Guard. You know, weekend warrior stuff." There was a pause. "She flies part-time. It's not a career, it's more of a lifestyle." I opened my eyes. Daniel turned to look at me. He'd heard it too. He didn't say anything. I watched the clouds outside for the rest of the flight. There was something specific about being insulted midair. You can't walk away. You can't leave the room. You just sit there, thousands of feet above the world, pretending not to hear someone casually rip apart everything you've worked for. I didn't correct her. I didn't defend myself. I'd done that before, and it never led anywhere. But the air felt different after that. Tighter. As if the cabin wasn't the only thing under pressure. I could feel something coming. I just didn't know it would arrive with smoke, alarms, and a voice asking if anyone on board was a pilot. Somewhere over the Gulf, maybe an hour into the flight, things were smooth. Outside, the sky was that deep, placid blue you only get at cruising altitude. Daniel had dozed off beside me, head tilted slightly toward the aisle, earbuds still in. I had just taken a sip of lukewarm coffee and was half listening to a podcast when it hit. The plane jolted. Not turbulence, a jolt. Sudden. Forceful. Loud. The kind of sound that cuts through every background noise at once. A hard, percussive thud followed by a mechanical whine and the unmistakable smell of something burning. The cabin lights flickered. Overhead compartments rattled. Somewhere behind me, a child started crying. The seatbelt signs flashed. Then came the drop. Not a full free fall, but a sharp descent. Fast enough that drink cups slid off trays. fast enough that people who weren't buckled felt it in their spines. I gripped the armrest. Daniel jerked awake, blinking fast. What the hell? Then the alarm started. That tone pilots never want to hear, the one that tells you something critical just failed. The left engine. I could feel it. A distinct tilt in the roll. Instinct more than anything. The intercom crackled to life, but all we got was static and half a sentence before it went silent. No updates. No instructions. Then the veer. Subtle at first. But real. You feel it in your gut when you've logged enough hours, when you know what a stable flight is supposed to feel like. This wasn't it. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, trying to mask panic behind professional urgency. Another followed, this one out of breath. And then the sentence that snapped everything into focus. The captain's collapsed. Is anyone on board a pilot? For a second, the entire cabin froze. People looked around as if a commercial pilot might materialize from the lavatory. No one moved. I was in 22A. I remember the tray tables still being down. My coffee had tipped, puddling at the edge. My hands moved before my brain did. I unbuckled. Stood up. Reached for my ID out of habit, even though no one had asked for it yet. Then, her voice. From behind me, loud enough to cut through the chaos. She's not even real military. Ellen. Sit down before you make it worse, she shouted, louder now. She's not qualified. She's part-time. Heads turned. Every pair of eyes between rows 20 and 30 landed on me. Daniel said something I didn't catch, probably trying to stop her, maybe to deflect. But the damage was already done. The words hung in the air like smoke. I should have been angry. Embarrassed. Something. But all I felt was clarity. Because it didn't matter what she said. Not in that moment. Not when 400 people were counting on someone to take control. I walked forward. A few passengers stepped back to make room. No one else volunteered. I made my way past the galley, through the curtain, toward the cockpit. A flight attendant tried to intercept me. I held up my ID before she could speak. I'm certified, I said. C-130's, multi-engine, FAA commercial. I've got this. She looked stunned. Shaking. But she didn't argue. Behind me, Ellen was still talking, something about liability, about getting someone official. But her voice was already fading. The closer I got to the front, the quieter everything became. Not literally, people were still murmuring, crying, praying, but inside me, there was a stillness. I'd been here before. Not at 35,000 feet on a commercial jet, no, but in the kind of moment where someone has to act. And no one else is stepping up. I wasn't Ellen's daughter-in-law anymore. I wasn't someone's +1 at brunch, or the family member who tolerated her sharpness in exchange for peace. I was a pilot. I was the most qualified person on that aircraft. And if someone didn't take the controls, we were going to lose more than just altitude. When I reached the cockpit, the door was open, ajar, technically. A flight attendant stood just outside, tears in her eyes. He passed out. I think it looked like a heart attack. He was slurring. Then nothing. I nodded. Let me through. The co-pilot was in the left seat, hands white-knuckled on the yoke. He looked young. Too young. Sweating through his shirt. He turned as I stepped inside. I've got flight hours on C-130s. Trained in multi-engine emergencies, I said quickly. I'll take right seat. He didn't hesitate. Just nodded, grateful. Thank God. I slid into position. My fingers moved before I could second-guess them. Instruments. Panels. Engine status. Hydraulics. Comms. The left engine was gone, catastrophic failure. Fuel shutoff valve was already closed. Fire suppression had been engaged. We were running on the right engine only, and barely stable. Okay, I said. Let's coordinate vectors. Closest airport with a long enough strip. He answered, New Orleans. Towers ready for us. They've cleared airspace. Good. I've got flaps and throttle. You watch horizon. Don't lose visual. I didn't think about Ellen. I didn't think about the people behind me or what they'd heard. I didn't even think about Daniel. Not yet. All I thought about was the next minute. And the one after that. Because when it's life or death, the only thing that matters is execution. As we leveled out and began a controlled descent, I found myself thinking, not about her words, but about how she'd said them. Not a whisper. Not a mutter under her breath. But a command. An accusation, hurled like a grenade in the middle of an already panicked cabin. She didn't say it to protect anyone. She said it to preserve her version of reality. A reality where I was never enough. Never professional enough. Never trained enough. Never real. She didn't care that I was a pilot. She cared that I threatened the image she built around herself. And in that moment, she'd rather have no one in the cockpit than see me take the controls. But I did. And we were still flying. I made a call to ATC, confirmed emergency priority, and began our descent checklist. The co-pilot started to find his rhythm again. His voice steadied. I talked him through each stage like I had with trainees a dozen times before. Behind us, the cabin had gone quiet. At one point, I glanced back. The door was closed again. Sealed. But in my mind, I could still hear her voice. She's not even real military. I didn't need to respond. The work would do that for me. By the time we were 10 minutes out, we had regained full control. The aircraft was stable. Altitude was holding. Systems had been rerouted through backups. The landing wouldn't be smooth, but it would be safe. I knew that. I don't know if Ellen did. I don't know what she thought when the nose dipped and we lined up with the runway. I don't know if she understood who was flying her to safety. But I did. And that was enough. In the galley, just before the cockpit, a flight attendant stood square in my path. She had one hand braced against the side panel, the other still gripping the seatbelt she'd used to steady herself. Her eyes were wide, and her voice came out fast, brittle. "Are you a pilot?" I didn't waste time explaining. I pulled out my ID, held it up where she could see the name, the credentials, the certs. C-130J, multi-engine, FAA commercial. Her hands trembled as she scanned it. She looked like she was waiting for someone else to take responsibility, like she wanted a second opinion before she made the call. But there wasn't time. "I've got hours," I said, calm. "I know what I'm doing." She swallowed hard. "Okay, go." I stepped past her. Inside the cockpit, the co-pilot was in the left seat, leaning forward, one hand on the yoke and the other tapping the comms with a kind of desperation that told me they weren't responding the way he needed them to. Sweat had soaked through the back of his collar. The captain was slumped to the side, breathing but completely unresponsive. His oxygen mask had been half secured, like he tried to put it on and didn't finish. "Status?" I asked, already sliding into the right seat. The co-pilot blinked. "Engine failure. Left side. We're dropping. Tower's asking for a decision, emergency landing or return." I can't get him to answer. "I've got right seat," I said, flipping up the safety guard on the secondary panel. "Focus on airspeed and heading. I'll work the systems." He nodded once. Thank God. From there, it was all about muscle memory. Checklist. Priorities. Secure power to the failed engine. Confirm fire suppression had deployed. Rebalance fuel draw. Adjust for drag. I could hear my dad in my head, calm, steady, never raising his voice when something broke mid-flight. Fly the aircraft first. Everything else is noise. We were losing altitude faster than we wanted, but it wasn't unrecoverable. The aircraft was stable. The controls were responsive. The right engine was holding. I kept my tone low and direct, walking the co-pilot through adjustments, managing systems, coordinating with Tower once we had clear comms again. Every once in a while, I'd glance at the captain. Still breathing, still out. That would be a problem later, for the airline, for the investigation. But for now, he wasn't the priority. The passengers were. It was only after we'd completed the first phase of stabilization that I had a second to think about what had just happened. Not the engine failure. Not the emergency descent. But the moment in the cabin. Her voice. Ellen's voice. "She's not even real military. Sit down before you make it worse." For years, I'd let those moments pass. Rewritten them in my head after the fact, softened them so Daniel wouldn't feel stuck between the two of us. I downplayed them, brushed them off, told myself they were just words. But this time, it hit different. Not because it hurt more. Because it meant more. Because even in a life-threatening situation, even with 400 lives at stake, she still couldn't let go of her version of me, the one where I was an accessory, a plus one, someone who didn't quite count. And yet here I was, sitting in the right seat, managing an emergency landing procedure, while her version of a real pilot was unconscious beside me. It's strange what you think about in those moments. Not death. Not glory. Just the absurdity of it all. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger takes energy, and every ounce of mine was going into flying that plane. But I did feel something. Not satisfaction. Not pride. Just a quiet shift. Like something that had been tilted off-center for years had finally righted itself. We hit the first marker for descent into New Orleans. I relayed the decision to tower, confirmed emergency clearance, and coordinated runway length and wind conditions with the co-pilot. His hands had stopped shaking. He wasn't talking much, but I could tell he was dialing back into himself. That was good. I'd need him for the last 10 minutes. I don't know what the passengers were doing behind that locked door. I imagine some were praying, some crying, some trying to distract their kids. The turbulence had eased by then, but we dipped low enough for people to understand we weren't cruising anymore. I wondered if Ellen was still talking, or if she'd finally gone quiet. Daniel knew. He had to. He'd seen the ID, heard the confirmation, watched me walk forward while his mother shouted after me. I don't know what he did in the moments that followed, if he defended me, if he tried to calm her down, or if he just stayed still and waited like the rest of them. Later, he'd tell me she went silent the second I disappeared past the curtain. That she stared straight ahead for the rest of the flight, clutching her seatbelt like it was a life preserver. That the man next to her asked, "Is she really a pilot?" and Ellen didn't answer. But that was later. In the cockpit, I focused on trim, flaps, and descent control. Every system mattered now. We were getting one shot at this. The fire suppression had done its job, but the left engine was dead weight. The right was running hot. We needed to be precise. Tower cleared us. Emergency vehicles were already staged. The co-pilot made the final approach call. I took controls. Nose down. Speed controlled. Geared down. Flaps set. We lined up perfectly. That was the moment I finally breathed. It didn't matter what Ellen thought of me. It didn't matter what she said in front of friends or behind my back. It didn't matter whether she ever acknowledged who I was or what I'd trained for. Because this was what it looked like. This was what it meant to be a pilot. Not the title. Not the uniform. The moment. And she had nothing to do with it. I flew us in clean. The tires hit the runway harder than I'd like, but it was stable. Brakes engaged. Reverse thrust deployed. The aircraft slowed. When we finally stopped, the silence in the cockpit felt like a vacuum. The co-pilot looked over at me, still wide-eyed. "You just saved everyone on this plane." I didn't respond. I just nodded, unbuckled, and leaned back in the seat. The paramedics boarded a few minutes later. They took over the captain's care. The flight attendants opened the main door. Passengers began to file out. I didn't go back into the cabin. I didn't need to. Let her walk past the closed cockpit door and know, just know, who had been behind it. We declared the emergency just shy of 35,000 feet. I remember watching the altimeter tick down, faster than I wanted. The turbulence had picked up, rough and irregular, what we call dirty air, and every few seconds the aircraft shuddered hard enough to make the overhead compartments rattle. The co-pilot, Jeremy, I'd learn later, had gone pale again. Not frozen, not useless, but right on the edge. He was still trying to push through it, but the second I looked at his grip on the yoke, hands clamped so tightly they'd started to shake, I knew I had to steady him before the aircraft got ahead of us. "Eyes on the horizon," I said, not unkindly, but clear. "I've got throttle and flaps." He glanced at me, swallowed once, and nodded. I took over the trim and began coordinating with tower. They'd cleared runway 11 at Louis Armstrong International and were keeping airspace wide open. Emergency crews had been mobilized and were already waiting on the tarmac. The left engine was dead weight. Drag was constant. Every adjustment took longer than it should have. But we were aligned. And we were flying. I stayed in communication with ATC the entire time. No wasted words. Just what we needed when we needed it. I asked for updated wind conditions, confirmed the runway length, made sure we had adequate visibility. The clouds were thin, scattered cumulus, nothing that would complicate the descent. But it was a long drop, and the plane was heavy. The co-pilot started breathing better after we passed through 20,000 feet. I talked him through the descent in intervals, not too fast, just enough to make sure he stayed with me. "We're okay," I said at one point. "The plane wants to fly. Let it." Outside the windows, the coastline was beginning to appear, just a faint outline at first, then the sprawl of city lights, the slow approach of water to land. Inside, the cabin had gone quiet. I couldn't hear them, but I could feel them. People holding hands. Praying. Bracing. Maybe hoping someone in the cockpit knew what they were doing. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't think about Ellen. I didn't think about what she had shouted or what she might be telling the other passengers now. That part of the plane felt a world away. Like another life. What I had was the present moment. Systems checks. Altitude corrections. Gear deployment. The landing gear came down later than I wanted it to, but it came down. The green indicators lit up. I triple-checked the hydraulic pressure. Everything held. And still, until the wheels touched, there was no guarantee. The plane was descending fast. Too fast, honestly, but it had to be. We needed the energy to overcome the drag from the dead engine. I called out approach flaps. He confirmed. I reduced thrust, kept her stable. The last 30 seconds felt like 10 minutes. Everything compressed into this narrowing window, margin for error vanishing with every foot of altitude. 500, the radio altimeter called out. "Runway in sight," Jeremy said. His voice didn't shake this time. We lined up straight. Crosswinds minimal. I could see the emergency vehicles now, red and white lights flashing along the runway edge. I made one last minor correction to heading, then took full control. The landing was rough. No way around it. You don't lose an engine and descend on partial power and expect smooth. But we hit hard and straight, nose still slightly high, spoilers engaged. The main gear took the brunt. Tires screamed. We bounced briefly, but settled fast. Brakes. Reverse thrust. Rudder. And then silence. We rolled to a stop. Nose wheel aligned. Systems intact. No injuries. No screams. Just the cabin lights flickering back to full brightness and the long, slow exhale of 400 people who didn't know whether they were going to make it down in one piece. I pulled off my headset and sat back for a second. Let the weight of what just happened catch up. Let my breath return to normal. "You did that," Jeremy said, looking over. We both knew it had been a team effort. But I nodded once. Just once. The paramedics boarded first. They rushed to the captain, got him on oxygen, started vitals. He was still unconscious, but stable. Tower kept us on the line long enough to confirm we were down and secure, then released us from comms. I didn't get up right away. I think part of me didn't want to walk out and face what waited on the other side of that cockpit door. Not the press, not the passengers. Just Ellen. Because I knew what she'd said. And I knew what I'd done. And I wasn't sure if there was a bridge left between those two things. The flight attendants started organizing the deplaning process. No slide deployment, there was no fire, no structural damage, but still fast and orderly. I could hear snippets of voices as the front door opened. I stayed seated. For years, Ellen had been the loudest voice in the room, even when she wasn't technically speaking. Her judgments filled the space. Her opinions shaped the temperature of every family gathering. And I had let it happen. Out of politeness. Out of deference. Out of 100 small reasons I'd never fully examined. But in that moment, something had shifted. I had taken control of that aircraft. Not because I wanted to prove something to her. Not because I needed the validation. But because I was trained. I was ready. And no one else had stood up. When I finally did leave the cockpit, I came out quietly. No announcement. No heroic reveal. The aisle was mostly clear, passengers already filing off into the jet bridge or being loaded into shuttle buses. I stepped out behind the paramedics. A few people glanced over. One woman touched my arm and said, "Thank you." That was it. Then I saw her. Ellen was standing to the side of the aisle, one hand gripping the overhead bin. Her mouth opened slightly when she saw me, but she didn't speak. Daniel was behind her, carrying both of their bags. He looked at me for a long second. I nodded. He nodded back. Ellen didn't say a word as I passed. Later, outside the terminal, after the paramedics had taken the captain to a hospital and the airline had begun organizing accommodations, I saw her again. She was sitting on a bench near the entrance, clutching her phone like she didn't know who to call. Daniel stood beside her, speaking softly. I didn't approach. I didn't need to. Whatever she thought of me before that flight, whatever narrative she built to make herself feel superior, it couldn't hold anymore. Not in the face of reality. Not after what had happened in that cockpit. She could rewrite it however she liked. Call it luck. Call it procedure. Say it was the co-pilot or the training or the aircraft itself. But she'd know. And she'd have to live with that. 400 people were alive because I didn't sit down when she told me to. Because I trusted my training. Because I made a decision. And saw it through. Outside the aircraft, EMTs rushed past me with a stretcher and medical kit. One of the attendants pointed them toward the cockpit. I stepped aside, gave them room, then stood there in the entryway for a moment longer, my hand still resting on the bulkhead. The captain was alive. That much was clear. They were stabilizing him, prepping for transport. Someone said it had been a cardiac episode, likely mild, but sudden enough to drop him unconscious mid-flight. He'd be okay. But he wouldn't have been if we hadn't acted fast. I gave my initial statement to the airline rep and FAA investigator right there on the tarmac. It wasn't formal yet, just preliminary facts. Time of engine failure. Sequence of action. Certs and ID confirmed. They asked for a callback number. I gave them mine, then stepped out of the way as they began locking down the site. The plane sat still behind me, surrounded by emergency crews and flashing lights. I walked back down the jet bridge alone. The adrenaline had burned off. My shoulders ached. My back, too, just from sitting stiff for too long in the right seat. But mostly it was the silence I felt. After hours of vibration, noise, and layered panic, the quiet hit hard. Down by baggage claim, passengers had started to gather. Some were slumped in chairs. Some stood in clusters, still processing what happened. I kept walking until I saw them. Daniel was there, hands in his pockets, jacket over one shoulder. And Ellen, standing rigid beside him, not looking at anything in particular. She saw me before he did. There was a second, just one, where our eyes met. And for the first time, she didn't look annoyed. Or impatient. Or disapproving. She just looked confused. Like she was seeing something she hadn't accounted for. She didn't say thank you. Not then. Not even close. She didn't say anything. Just stared. I kept walking. Later that evening, after we were all rerouted to a hotel by the airline, I got a call from my commander. He'd seen the news alert before I even had. Local station. Short segment. Off-duty Air Guard pilot lands jet after engine failure. By morning, it was in the national rotation. I didn't speak to reporters. I didn't post about it. But people found out anyway. My CO sent flowers. A few pilots from my unit messaged me to say, "You did us proud." One of the flight attendants emailed me directly 2 days later. She said, "I still cry thinking about how calm you were. You saved all of us. I don't know how you did it." The airline put me in touch with their internal safety board. They wanted a formal debrief. I agreed. The call lasted over an hour. They walked me through every decision I made, asked for thoughts on systems performance, training protocols, crew resource management. They thanked me at the end. Genuinely. Daniel tried to bridge the gap at home. He brought it up after dinner one night. We were back in our apartment, the news cycle already moving on, but the tension still fresh between us. He said she didn't mean it. I looked at him. She said it loud enough for half the plane to hear. "I know," he replied. "But she panicked. You know how she gets." "No," I said. "I know who she is." That was the first time I'd said it out loud. And I meant every word. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It wasn't a slip of the tongue or a misunderstanding. It was her. Her worldview. Her rules. Her refusal to accept that someone outside of her frame of reference could carry authority or skill or responsibility. It wasn't just about me. It was about everything I represented. The daughter-in-law she couldn't control. The service member she never respected. The woman she saw as playing dress-up in a uniform that didn't belong to her definition of real. And when that version of me stood up, when I said, "I've got it," she couldn't tolerate it. Not even to save herself. Daniel said nothing for a long time after that. Then finally, "You're right." It didn't fix things. But it helped. For weeks after, I kept replaying it all. Not the landing. That part had been clean. Tense, but procedural. What I kept thinking about was how many years I had bent to keep her comfortable. The holiday hosting. The dog sitting. The birthday gifts she never acknowledged. The business class upgrade I paid for, just so she wouldn't complain on the flight down. All of it, and for what? So she could mock my service in front of her friends? So she could try to erase my career every time she said part-time pilot? I'd spent a decade thinking if I was just a little more patient, a little more agreeable, maybe she'd meet me halfway. But that day on the plane, the mask cracked. And I saw the truth. Even in crisis, even in the most vulnerable, terrifying moment of her life, she couldn't bring herself to see me for who I was. But the rest of the world did. The passengers. The flight crew. The investigators. And me. For the first time in a long time, I saw myself clearly, too. Not the version filtered through family politics. Not the quiet, polite one trying to earn a seat at a table that kept pulling away. Just me. Qualified. Grounded. Capable. And no one could take that from me again. The card arrived 10 days after the landing. No return address, just her handwriting on the envelope, small, slanted, deliberate. Inside, a plain cream no card. No, dear. No, love. Just one line, "Glad you were on board." That was it. No mention of what she said. No acknowledgement of what she tried to stop me from doing. No apology. Daniel hovered by the kitchen counter as I read it. He didn't say anything at first. Then, I told her she needed to say something. I placed the card on the table. She didn't. It wasn't surprising. That's how Ellen operated. Say the minimum. Reframe it as a gesture. Then expect the relationship to resume as if nothing happened. I didn't respond. For the next couple of months, there was space. Not exactly distance. Daniel still talked to her occasionally, but space. She didn't call. Didn't text. No birthdays, no holidays. I figured that might be it. That she'd made peace with her version of events and decided to retreat into it. I would have been fine with that. But then, about 3 months later, she reached out again. This time it was Daniel's phone. A text, "Tell her I'd love to have you both over for dinner." Just something casual. I didn't reply. I didn't say anything for a full day. And when I did, it wasn't to her. I told Daniel I wasn't interested. Not in the performance of reconciliation. Not in pretending that one line in a card was enough to rebuild trust. He asked if I'd be open to it in the future. Maybe, I said. But not until she learns there are rules now. My rules. The first time I saw her again was at a family event Daniel insisted we both attend, a niece's birthday party. Neutral ground. Other people around. She approached me with a careful smile, wine glass in hand. She looked like someone stepping onto ice and not sure how thin it was. I said hello. Nothing more. She didn't bring up the flight. She didn't bring up what she'd said. Instead, she talked about Daniel's work. The weather. Someone's new dog. Surface-level chatter that kept her safely in her lane. I let her talk. And when she crossed it, when she made some offhand remark about how even part-timers can rise to the occasion, I put down my plate, stood up, and walked out. Didn't wait for Daniel. Didn't make a scene. Just left. He followed a few minutes later. "I didn't think she meant it like that," he said in the car. I looked out the window. She did. That's the point. From then on, I kept my distance. I didn't ban her from our lives, but I drew clear lines. If she wanted access to me, she'd have to earn it. No more passive-aggressive jokes. No more jabs disguised as compliments. No more pretending she could rewrite history and expect me to play along. I made it clear to Daniel, I wasn't asking for a feud. I wasn't demanding loyalty. I was simply done contorting myself to be palatable to someone who refused to see me clearly. It was the first time in our marriage I'd said something like that with no room for negotiation. And he got it. To his credit, he didn't try to mediate after that. He didn't make excuses or ask me to soften. He just observed. And I think, over time, he started to see what I'd seen all along. That Ellen didn't respect quiet strength. She respected boundaries. And when those were finally in place, things started to shift. Slowly, she adjusted. Her tone changed. Her language became more cautious, not warm exactly, but filtered. She asked before assuming things. She waited to be invited. There were still slips. There always are. The kind of ingrained behavior that doesn't vanish just because it's no longer welcome. But I enforced the line every time. If she said something undermining, I'd excuse myself. Politely. Clearly. And not return to the conversation. She noticed. And over time, so did everyone else. The balance of power shifted, not dramatically, not publicly. Just in small, persistent moments. I didn't shut her out. I didn't launch a campaign to change her. I just stopped chasing her approval. I stopped earning her respect like it was a currency I had to keep feeding. She could give it, or she could lose access. And I think, in her own quiet, pride-swallowing way, she started to realize that was the choice. The next time we had dinner, 6 months after the landing, it was different. I had invited her. Not out of obligation. Not to repair anything. But because I wanted Daniel to see that boundaries didn't have to mean exile. She brought a bottle of wine and a store-bought pie. She complimented the meal. She didn't bring up the flight. She didn't bring up the guard. She didn't test me. It was civil. Not warm, but civil. And that was enough. At the end of the night, as she put on her coat, she looked at me for a second longer than usual. Not with softness. Not with apology. But with something that felt close to acknowledgement. And maybe that was all I ever needed. Not to be liked. Not even to be accepted. Just to be recognized. For what I'd done. For who I was. And for the fact that the rules had changed, permanently. Because I had changed. And I wasn't going back. It's been 2 years since that flight. Some days, it still catches me off guard how ordinary everything seems. Morning alarms, inboxes, laundry. The world didn't stop after the engine did. Life kept moving. But something in me stayed changed. I'm now one of the senior instructors at our base, one of the only women running emergency response simulations. That's not a detail I highlight, but it tends to come up. Especially when a new recruit walks into the room, sees my name on the board, and does a double take. I don't lead with the story. I don't wear it like a badge. But when we run cockpit emergencies in the simulator and someone hesitates, hands frozen over the panel, unsure what to do, I tell them this: you don't rise to the occasion. You fall to your level of training. So train hard. And they listen. Because by now, most of them have heard the story. Someone always brings it up. Quietly, usually. In the break room, or after hours. You're the one from that commercial flight, right? I nod. Once. And then we get back to work. What happened at 35,000 feet isn't the thing I build my identity around. But it's the moment that sharpened it. I spent years trying to earn a kind of approval that was never going to be offered. I showed up. I bit my tongue. I made excuses for someone else's smallness because I thought that was grace. But grace doesn't mean giving away your voice. And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting how loud someone shouted when it mattered most. Ellen still introduces me at brunches sometimes. This is our hero, she'll say, too brightly, as if the weight of her past words could be erased by a little polish. I don't correct her. But I don't lean into it either. I let the words pass like weather, acknowledged, but not absorbed. Because I know who I was that day. I know who I still am. The woman who stood up when no one else did. The woman she tried to silence with 6 words and a lifetime of quiet dismissals. And the woman who walked down that aisle anyway. Daniel's relationship with her has shifted, too. Not dramatically. He still visits. Still checks in. But he sees it now, the patterns, the deflections. He doesn't argue when I opt out of dinners. He doesn't push when I say no. He just leaves space. And that's all I ever needed. My unit sent me a plaque last year. Not for the flight, though they mentioned it, but for my work training the next generation. Excellence under pressure, it says. It sits on a shelf in my home office. Not front and center, not hidden either. Just there. Like a quiet anchor. Sometimes I think about the other passengers on that flight. I don't know their names. I've only met a few in passing, people who reached out through social media or sent letters through the airline. One woman wrote, "I held my son's hand and kept whispering, 'Someone has us. Someone knows what to do.' I didn't know it was you. But I knew someone was fighting to keep us in the air." I still have that letter. Folded, tucked into a drawer. Because on the hardest days, the ones where the training drills don't go right or the chain of command drags its heels or some smug civilian throws the word part-time around like an insult, I remember her words. Someone has us. That's the legacy I care about. Not Ellen's version. Not the headlines. Just that. Being ready when it counts. Being steady when everything tilts sideways. Being the one who doesn't flinch. And if there's one thing I've learned since that day, it's this: you don't have to crash to wake up. You don't have to wait for the engine to blow, or the cabin to fill with smoke, or the lights to flicker before you realize what's been broken all along. But if it happens, if life puts you in that moment, make sure you're the one at the controls. Not the one trying to win approval. Not the one afraid to speak up. Not the one sitting down because someone else told you weren't enough. I used to think humility meant shrinking. Now I know better. It means standing exactly where you are, owning what you've built, and not apologizing for knowing what you're doing. That's not arrogance. That's integrity. And it's earned. Not by titles. Not by ceremony. But by actions taken when no one's looking. Or when everyone is. So when Ellen raises her glass and calls me our hero, I don't flinch. I don't need her to see me anymore. Because I see myself. And I'll never hand that back. Thanks for listening. Have you ever had to prove yourself in a moment that shouldn't have required proof at all? Or stood your ground when someone close to you tried to cut you down? Tell me in the comments, how did you handle it? And if this story hit close to home, like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about knowing your worth and holding the line.